Part 1. Red Dust of Dry Creek. The dust of Dry Creek was a second skin, a constant presence that Cole Bennett tasted in his water and felt in the grist of his teeth. It coated the parched blades of grass on his ranch, Bennett's draw, turning the vast Wyoming landscape into a study in beige and despair. The sun was a relentless hammer, beating down from a sky so pale it seemed bleached of all color. For 2 years, the heavens had been miserly, and the creek that gave his ranch its name was now just a winding scar of cracked mud and bleached stones, a bony finger pointing toward a future as dry as the ground itself. Cole stood on the porch of the small cabin he'd built with his own hands, the scent of horse sweat and dry earth clinging to him. He was a man carved from the land itself, tall and lean, with shoulders broadened by labor and hands calloused from reins and rope. Grief had etched lines around his pale blue eyes that the sun had not, a permanent shadow that the brightest day could not dispel. It had been nearly a year since Martha was taken by the fever, leaving behind a silence in the house that was louder than any storm, and a daughter who was the only reason his world hadn't crumbled entirely into dust. "Papa?" A small voice pulled him from his thoughts. Nora, 3 years old, with her mother's dark curls and his own determined chin, stood in the doorway, clutching a faceless corn-husk doll. She was the one green growing thing in his desiccated life. He turned, the harshness on his face softening instantly. "Right here, little bird. What is it?" "Millie is thirsty," she said, holding up the doll with solemn importance. Cole managed a tired smile and crouched down, taking the doll. "Well, we can't have that." He pretended to give the doll a drink from his canteen, making soft sipping noises. Nora giggled, a sound as precious and rare as a drop of rain. He scooped her into his arms, her small body a familiar, comforting weight, looking out over his land. The love for his daughter was a sharp ache in his chest, tangled with a fear that gnawed at him day and night. The ranch was failing. His cattle were thin. The price of feed was sky high, and his loan from Silas Crowell's bank in town loomed over him like a vulture circling a dying calf. Crowell owned the bank, sat on the town council, and seemed to own the very air people breathed in Dry Creek, and Cole owed him more than he could pay. 20 miles away, in the stuffy, one-room schoolhouse that smelled of chalk dust and unwashed children, Margaret Hayes Maggie was a figure of stark contrast to the world outside. At 29, with her dark hair pinned in a severe but practical bun and a simple, high-collared dress of Boston gray, she was an island of Eastern order in an ocean of Western chaos. 2 + 7 is 9, Thomas, not 10, she corrected gently, her voice crisp and clear. She tapped the slate with the edge of her wooden ruler, a tool she valued for its straightness, its unyielding measurements. It represented logic, reasoned things she clung to in a place that often seemed to have none. The children, a motley collection from 5 to 15, watched her with a mixture of respect and wary curiosity. She was a good teacher, patient and thorough, but she didn't smile easily. The town whispered about her. Old Maid, they called her, a term that stung more than she would ever let on. Prickly, standoffish. They knew she'd come from the city after some unpleasantness. "A scandal," they murmured. Something involving a wealthy benefactor she had supposedly disrespected. The truth was far more bitter. She had spoken out against a man's unwanted advances, and in doing so, had found every door in Boston society quietly closed to her. Wyoming was a desperate escape, a place where she hoped a woman could be judged by her work, not by rumors. After dismissing her students, Maggie walked the dusty half-mile to Mrs. Millie Parker's dress shop, a place of vibrant calicos and whispered gossip. Maggie's second job was keeping Mrs. Parker's books, a task she performed with meticulous precision. Afternoon, "Maggie, dear Mrs." Parker chirped, her round face flushed from the heat. She was a born meddler and matchmaker, but her heart was generally in the right place. "There's a stack of new invoices from the freight company." Maggie nodded, settling onto a high stool behind the counter. She opened the heavy ledger, the neat columns a comfort to her. Her mind found solace in numbers. They were honest. They didn't lie or spread rumors. As her pen scratched across the page, she frowned. A small discrepancy in a feed order Jed Cutter had brokered. The numbers were off, just by a few cents, but it was like a single discordant note in a perfectly tuned piano. It bothered her. "Something wrong, dear Mrs.?" Parker asked, peering over her spectacles. "Just a small error in the freight calculation," Maggie said, circling the number with her pen. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was a crack in the facade of things. And Maggie had learned the hard way that small cracks could lead to catastrophic collapses. She thought of Cole Bennett, who had come into the shop last week to buy thread for mending his daughter's dress. He had the look of a haunted man, his shoulders slumped with a weight far heavier than his years. The whole town knew he was struggling. He was proud, though. He hadn't said more than 3 words, his eyes fixed on some distant, sorrowful horizon. She felt a flicker of sympathy for him, a man drowning in the same unforgiving landscape she was trying to navigate. The inciting incident arrived not with a bang, but with a politely worded summons delivered by Sheriff Amos Lane. It called Cole Bennett to a special meeting of the Dry Creek Town Council. The air in the town hall was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and tension. The other ranchers present had the same weary, sun-beaten look as Cole. Silas Crowell sat at the head of the table, looking cool and immaculate in his dark suit, a stark contrast to the dusty, sweat-stained men before him. His smile was thin, a mere stretching of the lips that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. Reverend Pike was there, his face etched with concern, and a few other town merchants. Cole stood before them, his hat clutched in his hands, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. Crowell cleared his throat. "Mr. Bennett," he began, his voice smooth as polished river stone, "we've convened this meeting out of a deep and abiding concern for the moral and financial stability of our community, and, specifically, for the welfare of your daughter, Nora." Cole's head snapped up. "Nora, what's this got to do with my girl?" "A child needs a proper home." "Cole," Crowell said, the use of his first name a condescending intimacy, a mother's touch, a stable environment, with the ranch in its current condition, and you being a single man still in mourning. The council has reservations about renewing your loan. Furthermore, we must consider whether Bennett's Draw is a suitable environment to raise a young lady. A low murmur went through the room. This was an overreach, and everyone knew it. But Crowell held their debts, and a man in debt is a man in chains. "What are you saying?" Cole's voice was a low growl. "We are prepared to be reasonable," Crowell said, leaning back in his chair. "The council has decided on a condition for the extension of your financial obligations and for the formal certification of your guardianship." He paused for dramatic effect. "You must get married. You have 30 days. The room fell silent. Cole stared, speechless. It felt like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of him. Marry. The thought was a betrayal to Martha, a desecration of a memory he held sacred. That's not your right," he finally managed to say, his voice shaking with fury. "It is our right to protect our investments and ensure the well-being of a child within our jurisdiction," Crowell replied smoothly. "It is a condition of moral and financial standing." It was then that Mrs. Millie Parker, perhaps trying to be helpful, stood up. "Well, if it's a wife he needs, there is an option, a sensible one." Every eye turned to her. "Miss Hayes, the school teacher. She's respectable, educated, and of a marrying age. A very logical match." At that moment, the door to the hall opened. Maggie Hayes stood there, a ledger from the dress shop in her hand. Having come to deliver it to one of the merchants on the council, she had heard her name. She saw every face turn to look at her, their expressions a mixture of pity, speculation, and crude assessment. She felt her blood run cold, then hot with a familiar, searing indignation. She was being discussed like a broodmare at auction. Her eyes met Cole Bennett's across the room. She saw his raw shock and his fierce, desperate pride. He looked at her not as a person, but as the final nail in his coffin. "This is an outrage," Maggie said, her voice trembling but clear. She stepped fully into the room, her chin high. "I am not a parcel to be traded for debt. My life is not a solution to Mr. Bennett's financial problems or this council's twisted sense of morality." Cole's own anger flared, misdirected at her. "I have no intention of marrying anyone, least of all—" He trailed off, but the insult hung in the air. Least of all a prickly spinster from the east. Crowell watched the exchange with a flicker of amusement. "The condition stands. Mr. Bennett, the decision is yours." Cole stormed out of the hall, the dust swirling around his boots. Maggie stood her ground for a moment longer, her gaze sweeping over the council members with contempt, before she turned and walked out, her back as straight and unyielding as her wooden ruler. Sheriff Lane caught up with Cole outside, his face grim. He was a decent man trapped in an indecent position. "Cole, wait up." "Stay away from me, Amos," Cole bit out. "You need to listen," the sheriff said, his voice low. "This is more than just Crowell being a snake. Your wife's mother, she's been writing letters. From Boston. She's petitioned the territorial court. She says you're an unfit father on account of your grief and the drought. She wants to take Nora back east." The world tilted under Cole's feet. The grandmother, a woman he'd met only once at his wedding, had never shown an ounce of warmth. To lose Nora, it was unthinkable. It was the one thing that would truly break him. "Crowell knows this," the sheriff continued, his voice heavy with resignation. "He's using it. If you're a married man with a respectable wife, a good Christian woman like the schoolteacher, Mrs. Weatherly's claim has no teeth. If you're not, Crowell can foreclose, and the court will see a bankrupt, single father. They'll give Nora to her grandmother without a second thought. He has you cornered, Cole, every which way." Cole looked out at the dying sun, which was painting the sky in shades of blood and rust. He was trapped. His grief for Martha warred with his terror of losing Nora. His pride was a bitter pill in his throat. He thought of Maggie Hayes, her eyes flashing with intelligent fire and righteous anger. She was just as trapped as he was, a piece in Crowell's cruel game. His gaze drifted toward the dry creek bed running through his property. It was a symbol of his hope, a channel carved for life-giving water. Now, empty and cracked, he felt a kinship with it, a path meant for love and family. Now just a dry, dusty obligation. Across town, Maggie sat in her small, rented room. The wooden ruler held so tightly in her hands her knuckles were white. Once again, a powerful man was trying to dictate the terms of her life, using her as a pawn for his own ends. She had run 1,000 miles to escape that very thing, only to find it waiting for her in the red dust of Dry Creek. The choice before her was stark refuse and be branded a difficult, uncooperative woman, likely losing her position and her hard-won independence, or submit to this humiliating bargain to save a man she didn't know and a child who deserved a home. Love was supposed to be a choice, a partnership, not a business transaction born of desperation and blackmail. But in the unforgiving reality of the West, survival often left little room for what was supposed to be. Part 2. The Paper and the Cold Gaze. The wedding took place on a Tuesday, under the same indifferent sun that baked the plains. The interior of the Dry Creek Church was a testament to the town's perpetual struggle against the dust, which lay in a fine film over the pews and turned the light from the tall, narrow windows into hazy, sanctified beams. It was not a place of celebration, but of solemn transaction. Cole Bennett stood before Reverend Pike looking like a man awaiting a verdict, his best shirt feeling tight and strange, his hands scrubbed raw but still feeling the phantom grit of the ranch. He stared at a crack in the plaster above the Reverend's head, focusing on it as if it were the only thing holding the world together. This was for Nora. The words were a silent, desperate chant in his mind. This is for Nora. Maggie walked down the short aisle alone. There was no one to give her away. She wore the same simple, high-collared gray dress she wore to teach in, its starkness a quiet rebellion against the pretense of the occasion. It was a business dress for a business arrangement. Her face was a pale, composed mask, betraying none of the roiling humiliation she felt. She was a problem being solved, a box being ticked on Silas Crowell's checklist. She met Cole's gaze for a fleeting second and saw a mirror of her own resignation, overlaid with a deep, guarded resentment that made her stomach clench. He didn't want her there any more than she wanted to be there. Reverend Pike's voice, usually a source of comfort, sounded thin and reedy in the heavy silence. He spoke of union, of partnership, of holy matrimony, and the words fell like dead leaves onto the dusty floorboards. When the moment came for the vows, their responses were clipped, barely audible monosyllables. "I do." The words felt like lies. "You may kiss the bride," the Reverend announced, a hint of forced cheerfulness in his tone. A tense, awkward pause hung in the air. The small crowd misses. Parker, Sheriff Lane, a few other townspeople watched expectantly. Cole turned to her, his jaw tight, for the sake of appearances, for the paper that would be sent to the territorial court. It had to be done. He leaned in, and for a terrifying second, Maggie thought he would press his lips to hers. Instead, he turned his head slightly at the last moment, and the kiss was a brief, cool, and utterly impersonal touch of his lips to her cheek. It was over in an instant. But the feeling of being publicly branded lingered. A smattering of applause broke the tension. Mrs. Parker was dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, proclaiming how wonderful it was that they'd found each other. Silas Crowell, standing at the back, offered a slow, deliberate clap, a smug look of victory on his face. In the eyes of the town, everyone had won. The rancher had a wife, the child had a mother, and the council had upheld its pristine morality. Only the two people standing at the altar knew the truth. It was a victory for everyone but them. The wagon ride to Bennett's Draw was a study in silence. The squeak of the wheels and the plodding of the horse were the only sounds, stretching the 20 miles into an eternity. Nora sat between them, a small, confused bundle. Her thumb stuck firmly in her mouth as she stared at Maggie with wide, uncertain eyes. She was no longer just teacher. She was something else now, something strange and unsettling that had invaded the familiar world of her and Papa. When they arrived at the cabin, Cole carried a sleeping Nora inside and laid her gently on her cot. Maggie followed, carrying her single carpet bag, which contained all her worldly possessions. The cabin was larger than her rented room, but smaller than she'd imagined, built of sturdy, hand-hewn logs. It was meticulously clean, but stark, a space clearly lacking a woman's touch for some time. It felt like a fortress, and she was the invader. Cole turned from the cot, his face shadowed in the dim light. His voice was low and devoid of any warmth. "We need to set the terms," he said, not looking at her. "This is a contract. Miss Hayes, a piece of paper that keeps my daughter and my land safe. Nothing more. I am aware of that." "Mr. Bennett," she replied, her own voice cool and even. She would not let him see how his words wounded her pride. He gestured to a small room off the main living area, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a small washstand. "This will be your room. I expect you to be a mother to Nora, to care for her, and to keep this house. In return, you will have a roof over your head and your meals provided." He had laid out his side of the bargain. Now it was her turn. Maggie set her bag down, her posture straightening as if to brace herself. "My name is Maggie. And since we are married, you will call me that." My terms are as follows. I require a steady supply of books, paper, and ink. Nora's education is paramount, and it will be my domain. I will decide what she learns and when. I will also continue to keep the books for Mrs. Parker in town. The small income is my own, and I will retain my independence in that matter. Cole looked at her then, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had expected tears or meek compliance. He had not expected a counteroffer. He gave a curt nod. Fine, as long as your duties here are met. The lines were drawn. Two proud, wounded people, bound by a piece of paper, circling each other in the small cabin like wary animals. The first days of their arrangement were a series of small, painful collisions. Maggie, a creature of logic and efficiency, tried to organize the kitchen. She moved the flour bin closer to the hearth for easier baking and arranged the cast iron skillets by size. That evening, she found them all moved back. The flour bin was in the far corner. The skillets hung in a different order. She didn't have to ask. It was where Martha had kept them. It was Cole's silent, stubborn refusal to let her presence change anything, to let her erase the ghost that still occupied this house. She learned to work around his silent dictates, her jaw tight with resentment. Nora was a more immediate and heartbreaking challenge. The little girl, who had been curious and sometimes even warm toward Miss Hayes in the schoolhouse, was now fearful and distant. She clung to Cole's leg whenever Maggie entered the room. She refused to let Maggie braid her hair or read her a story, crying for Papa to do it. One evening, Maggie offered her a piece of gingerbread she had baked. Nora shook her head, her lower lip trembling, and buried her face in Cole's trousers. "She's just not used to you yet," Cole said gruffly, lifting Nora into his arms. He didn't sound apologetic. He sounded accusatory. The rejection was a constant, dull ache in Maggie's chest. It confirmed her deepest fear she was not wanted here. She was merely being used. She was a function, a placeholder wife and mother, valued only for the legitimacy her presence provided, the fear that she would never be truly loved, only ever utilized for her practicality, was a cold companion in her narrow bed at night. They lived separate lives under one roof. Cole rose before dawn. His work on the ranch a relentless cycle of mending fences that were barely holding on, tending to cattle that grew thinner by the day, and hauling water from the one well that hadn't yet run dry. Maggie managed the house, cooked the meals, and tried to create a routine for Nora. In the evenings, the lessons began. Maggie would sit with Nora at the rough-hewn table, patiently guiding her through the alphabet. Cole would sit by the fire, sharpening a tool or mending a piece of tack, his presence a silent, heavy blanket over the room. He never interfered, but he always watched. 2 weeks into the marriage, a letter arrived from the Dry Creek Bank. Cole opened it with a knot in his stomach. It was a new statement of his debt. His eyes scanned the figures until they landed on a new line item, guardianship and moral fitness assessment fee. It was an exorbitant sum, tacked onto his already crushing debt. It was a clear message from Silas Crowell the marriage was not a pardon, merely a stay of execution. The banker's hand was still wrapped firmly around his throat. Cole crumpled the paper in his fist, a low curse escaping his lips. He was still a prisoner. That same afternoon, while Cole was out checking a far pasture, Maggie decided to impose some order on the chaotic stack of receipts and ledgers stuffed into a wooden crate in the corner. It was work that soothed her, finding sense in the jumble. She sorted them by date, her sharp eyes scanning the familiar scrawl of invoices from Jed Cutter, the man who supplied most of the ranchers with feed and supplies at inflated prices. And there it was again. The same kind of discrepancy she'd noticed in Mrs. Parker's books, but magnified. A receipt for 10 sacks of cattle feed, with a weight scrawled next to it. A bill from Cutter for the same 10 sacks, but with a freight charge calculated on a much heavier weight. The numbers didn't match. On its own, it was a small thing, easily dismissed as a clerical error. But as she laid out more receipts, she saw a pattern, a consistent, methodical overcharging on freight, a few pounds here, a few there, all adding up. It was subtle enough that a man like Cole, exhausted and more concerned with the quality of the feed than the numbers on the paper, would never notice. But Maggie noticed. Her mind, honed on logic and arithmetic, saw it as clearly as if it were circled in red ink. It was a quiet, insidious form of theft. That night, a cold wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's single-glass window and forcing its way through the cracks in the door frame. The fire in the hearth sputtered, casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls. Nora was asleep on her cot, a picture of innocence in the tense silence. Cole sat staring into the flames, the bank notice lying on the floor beside him. Maggie sat at the table, the suspect receipts laid out before her like pieces of a puzzle. The wind gusted, and the door creaked open an inch. The firelight flickered wildly. For a moment, their three shadows were thrown into sharp relief against the far wall. Cole's was a tall, solitary shape on one side of the hearth. Maggie's was a still, rigid form on the other. Between them, the small, curled shadow of Nora. Three distinct figures sharing a space, their outlines sharp and separate, never quite merging into one. They were a family on paper, but in the flickering, uncertain light, their shadows told the truth they were not yet whole. They were just three strangers, bound together against the coming storm. Part 3. The Night of the White Wind. The weather in Wyoming Territory paid no mind to the calendar. One day in late autumn could be a sun-scorched echo of summer. The next could be a raw harbinger of the deep winter to come. The change, when it came, was mercilessly swift. It began as a strange, metallic taste in the air, a scent of iron and ice that made the horses restless in the corral. Cole, his eyes narrowed against the horizon, saw the clouds rolling in not as the promise of rain he so desperately needed, but as a bruised, purple wall that seemed to suck the very light and warmth from the sky. "Get the rest of the wood in," he called to Maggie, who was shaking out a rug on the porch, "and check the chinking on the north wall. This looks mean." There was no argument. A shared instinct for survival, honed by the harsh realities of the land, had become their most effective form of communication. Within the hour, the temperature plummeted. The first flakes of snow were not soft, poetic things, but hard, stinging pellets driven by a wind that shrieked like a banshee around the corners of the cabin. The world outside dissolved into a maelstrom of white. They were an island in a roaring, frozen sea. Inside, the fire roared in the hearth, a lone bastion of warmth and light. But a different kind of cold was beginning to settle in the small cabin. Nora, who had been listless all afternoon, began to cough. It was a small, dry sound at first, but by the time darkness fell completely, it had deepened into something raw and frightening. Maggie placed a hand on the child's forehead. It was burning. "She has a fever," she said, her voice tight with a concern that transcended their fragile truce. Cole was by the cot in an instant, his large, calloused hand replacing hers. The heat radiating from his daughter sent a jolt of pure fear through him. "I'll ride for Doc Abernathy." He was already reaching for his heavy coat. "You'll do no such thing," Maggie's voice cut through his panic, sharp and clear. "You won't make it a mile in this. The drifts will be over your horse's head, and the trail will be gone. You'll be lost in minutes." "I have to do something," he roared, his helplessness turning to anger. "I won't just sit here and watch her." He couldn't finish the sentence. The memory of Martha's fever, of its inexorable, fatal progression, was a living terror in the room. Nora let out another cough, and this time it ended in a harsh, wheezing sound, a tiny bellows struggling for air. Panic seized Cole's heart. It was the same sound. "Cole, look at me!" He turned, startled by the authority in her tone. The timid, defensive schoolteacher was gone. In her place was a woman of calm, focused intensity. Her eyes were clear, her jaw set. "Your panic will not help her," she said, her voice even but unyielding. "I need you to be my hands. I need you to do exactly as I say, without question. Can you do that?" He stared at her, a war of pride, fear, and desperation raging within him. Who was she to give him orders? But then he looked at Nora, whose small chest was visibly struggling with each breath, and the fight went out of him. He gave a single, ragged nod. "Good," she said, already moving. "First, put the largest kettle on the fire and fill it with water. Keep it boiling. We need the steam. It will help her breathe. Then, I need clean cloths, a bowl of the coolest water from the barrel, and the small tin box from the bottom of my carpet bag." For the first time since she had arrived, Cole moved without hesitation to obey her. He worked with a frantic energy, stoking the fire until it blazed, hauling the heavy kettle onto its hook. He found the cloths and the bowl. The steam soon began to fill the cabin, the hissing of the kettle a counterpoint to the howling of the wind outside and the rasping of Nora's breathing within. Maggie opened her tin box. Inside were small, neatly labeled packets of dried herbs and roots. The scent of lavender, mint, and something sharp and medicinal filled the air. She took a small handful of leaves, crushed them in her palm, and dropped them into a mug of the boiling water. The rising steam carried a new aroma, a clean, penetrating scent. "My mother taught me," she said, not looking at him, as if sensing his unspoken question. "She was a doctor's daughter. These are for opening the lungs." She held the steaming mug near Nora's face, letting the child inhale the vapor. And so began their long vigil. The night stretched into an eternity, marked by the sputtering of the lamp and the child's labored breaths. Maggie was the general, and Cole was her soldier. The cloths, she would command, and he would be there, wringing out the cool linen to place on Nora's forehead and neck. "More wood," she would say, and he would brave the raging storm for the few seconds it took to grab another armload from the porch, returning covered in snow, the cold clinging to him. "Hold her up. It's easier for her to breathe sitting." He would gently lift his daughter, her small, hot body limp in his powerful arms, holding her for what felt like hours while Maggie coaxed her to sip a few drops of a willow bark tea to fight the fever. The barriers between them, the pride, the resentment, the forced circumstances of their union crumbled away, rendered meaningless by the primal urgency of the moment. They were no longer the rancher and the old maid, the widower and the unwanted wife. They were two people fighting a common enemy for the life of a child they both, in their own ways, loved. In the small, quiet hours before dawn, when exhaustion was a physical weight on their shoulders, he found himself talking. He told her about the day Nora was born, how small she was, how Martha had laughed and said she had his stubborn chin. He spoke of his late wife not as the untouchable ghost who stood between them, but as a woman, a mother, whose memory he was terrified of failing. Maggie listened, her hands never ceasing their work, and she, in turn, shared a piece of herself. "My younger brother was often sick as a boy," she said softly, her eyes on Nora's flushed face. "I would sit with him just like this. My mother said I had the touch for it, a calm hand. She called it." Cole looked at her then, truly looked at her. He saw the deep shadows of fatigue under her eyes, the stray strands of hair that had escaped her severe bun, the fierce, unwavering concentration on her face. There was no trace of the prickly, standoffish woman from town. He saw only strength, intelligence, and a profound, quiet compassion. The wall of ice he had so carefully constructed around his heart didn't just crack, it began to melt. It was just as the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the window, turning the raging whiteness outside into a soft, ethereal landscape, that the change came. The harsh, rasping sound from the cot softened. It became deeper, more regular. Maggie laid her hand on Nora's forehead again. The raging fire had cooled to a manageable warmth. The fever had broken. Nora stirred. her eyelids fluttering. She let out a small, sleepy sigh, and for the first time in nearly 12 hours, she breathed without a struggle. A wave of relief so powerful it was dizzying washed over Cole. He sank onto a nearby stool, his head in his hands, the strength draining from him all at once. Maggie watched him for a long moment, then gently pulled a blanket over Nora's sleeping form. He looked up, his eyes raw with exhaustion and unshed tears. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick. "Maggie, thank you." It was more than just gratitude for the long night. It was an acknowledgement, an apology, a concession. It was the first plank in a bridge across the chasm that had separated them. When the sun finally rose, it was on a world transformed. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a pristine, silent blanket of snow that muffled all sound and sparkled with a blinding intensity. The world felt clean, scoured, new. But the storm had taken its toll. Looking out from the cabin, Cole could see that a section of the corral fence was down, and the small herd of cattle he so desperately needed to see through the winter was gone, scattered by the storm. "I have to go after them," he said, his voice heavy with the weariness of a new battle beginning before the last one had truly ended. "I'll get some food ready," Maggie said, already moving toward the hearth, "and I'm coming with you." He started to object out of habit. It was a man's work, dangerous and hard. But he stopped. He looked at her, then at the peacefully sleeping child. The night had proven her strength in ways he could never have imagined. He just nodded. "We'll need 2 horses." They rode out into the vast, white wilderness, the air so cold it burned their lungs. Cole led the way, his knowledge of the land guiding them through the deep drifts. Maggie followed, her eyes scanning the landscape, sharp and observant. It didn't take long to find the tracks. They found the cattle huddled together for warmth in a small, sheltered canyon a few miles from the ranch. Getting them moving was difficult work. The animals were cold, scared, and stubborn. As Cole worked to push the herd from one side, a young steer broke from the group, heading for a deep, snow-filled ravine. "I've got him," Maggie called out. Without waiting for his direction, she spurred her horse, her movements confident and capable, cutting off the steer's escape with a skill that surprised him. Cole watched, momentarily stunned. He'd assumed, like most Easterners, she would be clumsy and uncertain on horseback, but she rode with a natural, easy grace. She herded the stray back toward the main group, her focus absolute. As they worked together, pushing the reluctant herd back towards the draw, a new rhythm developed between them, an unspoken partnership. He would point, and she would understand. She would see a stray before he did and move to intercept. At one point, navigating a tricky, ice-covered slope, he dismounted to lead his horse. Without a word, he reached over and took the reins of her horse as well, leading them both through the dangerous patch. When they were on solid ground again, he handed her reins back. The simple act of passing the leather from his hand to hers was charged with a new significance. It was a transfer of trust, freely given and capably received. They returned to the cabin as dusk began to paint the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and lavender. They were bone-tired, cold, but victorious. The cattle were secure. Nora was sleeping soundly, her fever gone. The world, which had seemed so intent on destroying them just hours before, felt, for the first time, like a place where they might just survive. That night, the silence at the dinner table was not the cold, heavy silence of strangers, but the comfortable, weary silence of allies. When Cole looked at Maggie across the table, he no longer saw the woman forced upon him by Silas Crowell. He saw the woman who had saved his daughter's life and ridden beside him through a blizzard to save his livelihood. Pride could not survive a night of white wind. It was a luxury for men who had nothing real to lose. And in its place, something new and infinitely more valuable had begun to take root. Part 4. The truth in the ledgers. The aftermath of the blizzard left an uneasy peace upon Bennett's draw. The snow melted under a returning sun, turning the parched land into a sea of mud before the dust. Inevitably, reclaimed its dominion. But inside the cabin, the thaw was more permanent. The cold, silent spaces that had once separated Cole and Maggie had been filled with a quiet, shared respect. He no longer moved her belongings back to their original places. She no longer felt the sting of being an outsider. They moved around each other with an economy of motion that spoke of a burgeoning partnership, a silent acknowledgement of the battle they had won together. It was this new, fragile trust that gave Maggie the courage to act on the suspicions that had been nagging at her since before the storm. One evening, after Nora was asleep, she watched Cole sit by the fire, staring at the crumpled bank notice from Crowell as if it were a venomous snake. The weight on his shoulders seemed immense enough to crush him. "Cole," she began, her voice soft but firm, drawing his gaze from the flames. "The night of the storm, I helped with what I know, medicine, herbs." He nodded slowly, his expression guarded but no longer hostile. "You did more than help. Maggie, you saved her." "My knowledge of numbers is better than my knowledge of herbs," she continued, pressing her advantage. "I have been keeping books for years. I see patterns. I believe Mr. Crowell and Mr. Cutter are taking advantage of you, of this whole valley. Let me look at your ledgers. All of them. Let me use the skills I have to fight them." It was a profound challenge to his pride. For a man of the West, his word and his ability to manage his own affairs were paramount. To admit he had failed, that he had been cheated without even realizing it, was a deep humiliation. He looked at her, at the intelligence and determination shining in her eyes. He thought of the long night, of how her calm competence had been his only anchor in a storm of fear. He had been trying to fight this battle alone with his fists and his sweat, and he was losing. Perhaps it was time to try a different weapon. He rose without a word, walked to the large wooden crate in the corner, and lifted it onto the table. It was heavy with the weight of years of paper, of debt, of dwindling hope. "They're all in here," he said, his voice rough. "I can make no sense of them." For Maggie, the chaotic jumble of receipts, invoices, and bank drafts was not a source of confusion, but a puzzle waiting to be solved, with the lamplight casting a warm glow over the table. She went to work. This was her territory. She emptied the crate, sorting the papers into neat piles by year, then by month. Cole sat across from her, cleaning a rifle, the rhythmic scrape and click of the metal a steady percussion to the soft rustle of paper. He watched her, fascinated. She was methodical, her focus absolute. She took out her wooden ruler and a fresh sheet of paper, drawing a series of neat columns. Date, invoice hash, item, billed amount, bank draft. Slowly, meticulously, she began to fill the columns, cross-referencing every single transaction. The hours ticked by. The fire burned down to glowing embers. Cole stopped his work and simply watched as her pen flew across the page, a general marshalling her paper army. Around midnight, she stopped. She laid her pen down with a quiet finality and tapped a specific line on her chart with the edge of her ruler. "Here," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "April 17th of last year. A charge from Mr. Cutter for 20 sacks of winter feed, a substantial amount. Do you remember that delivery?" Cole frowned, rubbing his tired eyes. "I don't recall. April was a hard month. A horse went lame. I was trying to—" "You were here," Maggie interrupted gently. "In this cabin. With Doc Abernathy, your horse had thrown you, and you'd broken 2 ribs. The doc's own daybook, which I balanced for him last month. Notes he was here with you all afternoon. You couldn't have received a delivery? Cole, no one was here to sign for it. Yet the bank paid the invoice. You paid for 20 sacks of feed that never arrived." He stared at the ledger, then at her face, the truth dawning on him like a sickening sunrise. It wasn't just incompetence on his part. It was calculated theft. "There's more," she said, her voice gaining strength. She guided him through her findings, her ruler pointing out the deceptions one by one, the systematic overcharging on freight, the mysterious assessment fees that appeared after every downturn in the cattle market, a bill for a new water pump he had paid for in cash, which had then been financed through the bank again as part of his loan, forcing him to pay for it twice. It was a web of deceit, so intricate and woven into the fabric of his finances that he had never been able to see it. "Cutter creates the false bills," Maggie explained, her logic cold and clear. "Crowell's bank pays them without question, adding the amount to your loan. They both take a piece. They're bleeding you dry. Cole, on paper, for the first time in a year." The grief and despair in Cole's eyes were replaced by a hard, dangerous glint of pure rage. He wasn't just failing. He was being systematically destroyed. The next morning, they rode into town together. They were not husband and wife. They were a united front. When they walked into the polished, intimidating quiet of the Dry Creek Bank, the teller's eyes widened. Silas Crowell emerged from his office, a look of mild surprise on his face that quickly hardened when he saw Maggie's determined expression and the ledger she carried under her arm. "Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Bennett, an unexpected pleasure. To what do I owe this joint visit? We've come to discuss some discrepancies in my account." "Crowell," Cole said, his voice a low growl. They sat in Crowell's office, the air thick with the scent of leather and smug authority. Maggie laid the ledger and her meticulously charted paper on his large mahogany desk. She didn't speak with emotion. She spoke with numbers. "On the date of October 4th, you approved a payment to Jed Cutter for freight charges calculated at 200 pounds over the manifested weight," she began, her voice crisp. "On December 9th, you added a market volatility fee to Mr. Bennett's loan, a fee which is not stipulated in the original loan agreement." She continued for several minutes, laying out the architecture of his fraud with unwavering precision. Crowell listened, a faint, condescending smile playing on his lips. When she was finished, he didn't even glance at the papers. He simply steepled his fingers and looked at Cole, dismissing Maggie entirely. "Cole, he said with a sigh, as if speaking to a child. "You've let this woman fill your head with nonsense. Bookkeeping is a complex art. A few minor errors are to be expected. She doesn't understand the way things are done out here." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential, man-to-man tone. "I understand you're under a great deal of pressure. The drought, your grief, it's a heavy burden for any man. I have a solution, a moral one, that will give you peace." He slid a fresh document across the desk, along with a pen. "This is an agreement. It places the financial management of Bennett's Draw under the bank's trusteeship. We will handle the bills, the suppliers. You just focus on what you're good at: the horses, the cattle. We'll ensure the ranch survives, and Nora will have a secure home. All you have to do is sign, end the struggle. Cole, let us help you." The offer was insidious, a poison disguised as medicine. It preyed on every insecurity Cole harbored: his feeling of failure as a provider, his exhaustion, his secret shame that Maggie had seen what he could not. Peace. The word was a siren song. To lay down the burden, to stop fighting the numbers, to just work the land. He looked at the paper, the neat legal print blurring before his eyes. His hand reached for the pen for a single, terrible moment. He was going to sign. "Don't you dare!" Maggie's voice was as sharp as cracking ice. She stood up, placing her hand flat on the document, covering the signature line. Cole looked up at her, startled. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were locked on Crowell, blazing with cold fire. "You are a thief, Mr. Crowell, and a coward. You hide behind ledgers and legal papers, but the numbers don't lie." She picked up her own sheet of figures. You have stolen a documented total of $412.63 over the last 2 years through these fraudulent fees alone. Not a minor error, but a systematic campaign of theft. We are not signing this. We are here to inform you that we will be auditing every transaction you have ever conducted with this ranch, and we will be speaking to the other ranchers. She slid the paper back across the desk. Cole watched her, mesmerized. The shame he had felt moments before was burned away by a surge of fierce admiration. She was magnificent. They left the bank, leaving a stunned and furious Silas Crowell in their wake. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the calm before a new storm, one they would face together. That evening, as they sat at the table, the abandoned ledgers pushed to one side. Cole felt a familiar sense of inadequacy creep back in. "I should have seen it," he said, his voice low. "It was my ranch, my responsibility." "He counted on that," Maggie said, her gaze steady. "He counted on you being too busy surviving to notice. He counted on you being a rancher, not an accountant. But he didn't count on us." She paused, then pointed out the window, toward a part of the property where the skeletal remains of an old well-drilling rig stood silhouetted against the twilight sky. "Your father tried to dig a well there, didn't he?" Cole nodded. "He did. Hit bedrock. Gave up. It's been a symbol of bad luck ever since." "It's a symbol of trying alone," Maggie corrected him gently. "What if you weren't alone? What if all the ranchers who are being cheated by Cutter and Crowell worked together? What if we bought our feed in bulk from a supplier in Cheyenne, cutting Cutter out entirely? What if we pooled our resources, hired a real driller, and dug a new well right here, one deep enough to find water for all of us to share?" The idea was radical. The ranchers of Dry Creek were independent to a fault, proud men who asked for help from no one, but they were also being driven into the ground, one by one. Cole looked from the abandoned well, a monument to solitary failure, to Maggie's face, illuminated by the lamplight. Her plan was audacious. It was brilliant. And for the first time in a long time, the dry, cracked earth of Bennett's Draw didn't feel like a grave. It felt like a battlefield where he finally had a chance to win. Part 5. They forced him to marry the old maid. Silas Crowell was not a man to be challenged. When Cole and Maggie walked out of his bank, they had not merely issued a threat, they had declared war. And Crowell, a master tactician of finance and public opinion, moved to crush the rebellion before it could gain a single convert. He did not retaliate with foreclosure notices or legal papers. His first strike was far more insidious. He attacked their names. Within days, a notice was posted on the town hall door, signed by Crowell in his capacity as council chairman. It announced a public community hearing concerning the financial stability and moral fitness of the guardianship of Nora Bennett. The words were couched in the language of civic duty, but the intent was as sharp and deadly as a razor. It was a public trial, a stage for a character assassination, and the entire town of Dry Creek was invited to watch. The whispers started immediately. Cole Bennett, they said, had been duped by that sharp-tongued Eastern woman. She'd filled his head with numbers and nonsense, turning him against the very man who was trying to help him. Maggie felt the change in the chill of the air at the dress shop, in the way the other women would fall silent when she entered. The label they had always applied to her old maid was now spoken with a new, venomous inflection, laced with suspicion. She was a meddler, a home-wrecker, an unsuitable guardian for a motherless child. The day before the hearing, the final piece of Crowell's strategy arrived, a polished black carriage, looking utterly alien against the dusty backdrop of Dry Creek, rolled to a stop in front of the town's only hotel. From it emerged a woman dressed in severe, expensive black silk, her face a mask of grim propriety. She was followed by a portly man in a city suit, carrying a leather briefcase. Cole, in town for supplies, froze when he saw her. The blood drained from his face. It was Eleanor Weatherly, his late wife's mother, the woman from Boston who believed he was an unfit, backwater widower incapable of raising her granddaughter. The hearing was held in the town hall, the same room where Cole had been given his 30-day ultimatum. This time, however, it was packed to the rafters, the air thick with sweat, curiosity, and judgment. Every rancher, every merchant, every wife in Dry Creek was there. They were not just spectators. They were the jury in this makeshift court. Cole and Maggie sat alone at a small table at the front, a pair of defendants. Across from them sat Crowell, flanked by Jed Cutter, whose brutish confidence was bolstered by the crowd. And in the front row, a looming presence of righteous disapproval, sat Mrs. Weatherly and her lawyer. Sheriff Amos Lane stood uneasily by the door, his face a study in conflict, his authority completely usurped by the proceedings. Crowell began, his voice oozing feigned concern. "Friends, neighbors, we are here for a painful but necessary task. We are here to protect the most vulnerable among us." His gaze settled on Nora, who was being cared for by Mrs. Parker at the back of the room, oblivious to the fact that her entire future was being debated. He painted a masterful picture. Cole was a good man, he said, but broken by grief and hardship. His judgment clouded. He presented documents showing the ranch's mounting debt, framing it not as a result of drought and fraud, but as gross incompetence. "This is a man on the verge of ruin," Crowell declared. "Is that a stable home for a child?" Then he turned his attention to Maggie. And into this sad situation comes an outsider, a woman with a troubled past, a woman who, instead of offering comfort, has sown discord, making wild, unsubstantiated accusations against respected members of this community. He twisted Maggie's meticulous accounting into a malicious attack, her intelligence into a dangerous weapon. Jed Cutter was next. He produced two grimy-looking cattle hands who mumbled rehearsed testimony about seeing Cole drunk and despondent, about hearing shouting from the cabin. They spoke of a cold, severe woman who seemed to have the rancher under her thumb. It was all lies, transparent and vile. But in the charged atmosphere of the room, the lies found purchase. When it was Maggie's turn, she stood tall, the ledger in her hands. She tried to present her evidence, to show the numbers, the irrefutable proof of theft. "If you will please look at the invoice from April 17th, she began, her voice clear and steady. Crowell cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "We are not here to get lost in a woman's confusing arithmetic. We are here to discuss morality, character." Mrs. Weatherly's lawyer stood up, his voice booming. "My client, Mrs. Eleanor Weatherly, the child's natural grandmother, is here to offer a stable, prosperous, and morally upright home. A home in Boston, with every advantage a young girl could desire. A home far removed from bankruptcy, and from a guardian of questionable repute." He stared directly at Maggie. The room erupted in murmurs. The tide was turning into a flood, threatening to sweep them away. The ranchers Cole had hoped would support him looked down at their boots, their own debts to Crowell keeping them silent and shackled. "She's nothing but a bitter old maid, trying to steal a good man's ranch," a voice yelled from the crowd. The insult struck Maggie like a physical blow. She flinched, her composure finally cracking. Her shoulders sagged, and the ledger in her hand suddenly seemed impossibly heavy. All her logic, all her truth, was worth nothing against a wall of prejudice. Cole saw it. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes, the momentary defeat, and in that instant, something inside him snapped. It was no longer about his land. It was no longer about his debt, or his pride, or even his fear of losing Nora. It was about the woman who had sat by his daughter's side through a feverish night, the woman who had ridden into a blizzard to save his herd, the woman who was now being crucified for daring to be intelligent and strong. He rose to his feet, slowly, deliberately. He was not an eloquent man. He did not have Crowell's polished words or the lawyer's booming voice. He was a rancher, his hands calloused, his face burned by the sun and etched with sorrow. He took off his worn hat, holding it in both hands, crushing the brim. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. He looked at the faces in the crowd, his neighbors, the people he had known his whole life. Then he looked at Silas Crowell, and his eyes were chips of blue ice. Finally! His gaze came to rest on Maggie, and his expression softened. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the silent, watchful room. It was raw, honest, and utterly unshakable. "You're right," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "This wasn't a love match. This wasn't my choice." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, letting Crowell and the lawyer and his mother-in-law savor their apparent victory. Then he straightened his shoulders and spoke the words that would change everything. "They forced the rancher to marry the old maid," he said, his voice ringing with a fierce, protective clarity that stunned the crowd into absolute silence. But she ended up owning his heart forever. A collective gasp went through the room. It was a confession, a declaration, and a defiance all in one. It was the truth, spoken so plainly and with such profound feeling that it shattered the web of lies Crowell had so carefully woven. He hadn't just defended her. He had claimed her. He had chosen her. Here, in front of everyone. The silence was broken by the sound of a heavy door opening at the back. Reverend Pike stepped forward, his face grim. "Silas, I believe this belongs to you," he said, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. He strode to the front and laid a stack of invoices on the table, the fraudulent invoices Jed Cutter had submitted to the church for non-existent repairs. "Our bookkeeper, as it happens, is also Mrs. Parker, and she learned her trade from the very best." He nodded toward Maggie. Before Crowell could respond, Doc Abernathy stood up. "You want to talk about character?" he demanded, his voice trembling with indignation. "Let me tell you about the night of the blizzard. I couldn't get through. No one could. But Margaret Hayes stayed up all night, and she saved that little girl's life with her own 2 hands and her own knowledge. Is that the act of an unfit guardian?" Then a rustle from the back. Mrs. Millie Parker, her face flushed with purpose, pushed her way to the front. She held up a long sheet of paper, covered in signatures. "These are from nearly every small rancher in this valley. Mr. Crowell," she announced. "A petition demanding an investigation into your bank's assessment fees. It seems Mr. and Mrs. Bennett aren't the only ones with confusing arithmetic in their accounts." The room was in an uproar. The silent, intimidated men were now finding their voices. A low rumble of anger directed at the banker's table. Sheriff Lane, seeing the tide turn, finally seemed to grow a spine, moving to stand between the ranchers and Crowell. Just then, a man who had been sitting quietly at the back stood up. He was a stranger, dressed in a plain but well-kept suit. "That will be quite enough," he said, his voice calm but commanding instant respect. "I am Judge Lawrence, from the county seat. I was asked by Mrs. Weatherly's counsel to observe these proceedings, and I have seen and heard quite enough." He walked to the front of the room, his gaze sweeping over the chaos. "This is not a court of law. It is a public disgrace." His eyes settled on Crowell, hard as nails. "Mr. Crowell, based on the testimony and evidence I have seen here today, I am ordering a full, independent audit of the Dry Creek Bank's books to be conducted by the Territorial Marshal's Office." A wave of shock silenced the room. "Furthermore," the judge continued, his gaze softening as he looked at Cole and Maggie, and then to a frightened Nora at the back. "The welfare of a child is not a tool for financial leverage or public spectacle. Until this audit is complete, temporary guardianship of Nora Bennett will remain fully and completely with her father, Cole Bennett, and his wife, Maggie Bennett." He looked directly at Mrs. Weatherly, whose face had gone pale. "Madam," Your concerns may be genuine, but your methods are questionable. I suggest you wait for the law to do its work." The judge brought his hand down on the table with a crack that sounded like a gavel. The hearing was over. Crowell was ashen-faced, his smug confidence shattered. Jed Cutter looked like a cornered animal. For the first time, the people of Dry Creek had seen that the Emperor had no clothes. Cole stood, his hat still clutched in his hand. He turned to Maggie, who was looking at him with tears shining in her eyes. They were not tears of pain or humiliation, but of something new, something she had never allowed herself to hope for. In the wreckage of Crowell's public trial, among the whispers and the lies, they had found something true. His words echoed in the sudden, hopeful silence of the room. A promise made not before a preacher, but before the entire world they knew. She ended up owning his heart forever. Part 6. A Proposal on the Prairie. The ride back from Dry Creek was steeped in a profound, ringing silence. It was not the hostile quiet of their first journey to the ranch, nor the weary quiet after the blizzard. This was a silence heavy with unspoken words, with the echo of Cole's declaration still hanging between them in the dusty air. He had laid his heart bare in front of the entire town, using it as a shield to protect her. Maggie sat beside him on the wagon bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, stealing glances at his strong, stoic profile. He had not looked at her since he'd spoken the words. As if the admission had cost him everything he had, she felt a terrifying, unfamiliar hope unfurl in her chest, a fragile green shoot pushing up through dry, cracked earth. When they reached the ranch, Cole lifted a sleeping Nora from the wagon and carried her inside. After tucking her into her cot, he went not to the hearth, but to a large, dust-covered trunk at the foot of his own bed. Maggie watched as he opened it, a scent of cedar and thyme filling the small room. He rummaged for a moment, his broad shoulders hiding what he was doing, before closing the lid with a soft click. He turned to her, his face grim in the fading light, but his eyes held a new, nervous uncertainty. "Walk with me," he said, his voice quiet. He led her away from the cabin, not towards the corral or the barn, but out into the open prairie, to a shallow valley she had never explored. The sun was setting, bleeding purple and gold across the horizon, and a gentle breeze made the tall heads of wild barley rustle and sway like a golden sea. The world felt vast and still, a cathedral built of earth and sky. He stopped in the center of the valley and turned to face her, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. He took a deep, shaky breath, as if preparing for a physical blow. "Maggie," he began, his voice rough. "What I said back there, in the town hall, I meant every word, but it wasn't the right way for you to hear it. It wasn't fair to you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object that glinted in the last rays of sunlight. It was a simple silver ring, worn smooth with time, with a delicate, hand-etched design of intertwining vines. "This was my mother's," he said softly. "She gave it to my father on their wedding day. He gave it back to her when I was born." He held it out to her, not in her palm, but offering it between his thumb and forefinger. His hand, she saw, was trembling slightly. "The first time we stood before the Reverend, it was a lie. It was a contract signed under duress. We were forced, this time." He finally lifted his head, and his gaze met hers, clear and stripped of all pretense. The sorrow was still there, a part of him she knew would never fully fade, but it was joined now by a raw, vulnerable hope that mirrored her own. "This time, it's for my heart," he finished, his voice cracking on the last word. "Margaret Hayes, would you do me the honor of being my wife for real this time, by choice? My choice." Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back spilled over, tracing silent paths through the dust on her cheeks. She had spent her entire adult life feeling like a commodity, a problem to be solved, a function to be filled, to be chosen, freely and with such profound sincerity was a gift so overwhelming she couldn't speak. She could only nod. A convulsive, desperate motion. A slow smile. The first genuine smile she had ever seen from him. Transformed his face, erasing years of grief and hardship. He gently took her left hand and slid the cool, smooth silver onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He did not release her hand. Instead, his fingers intertwined with hers. His calloused, work-roughened skin a warm, solid anchor. They stood there as the last of the light faded and the first stars pricked the deep velvet of the sky. Their hands clasped together, saying nothing. No more words were needed. Later that night, long after the moon had risen, they stood on the porch, wrapped in the cool silence of the prairie. They spoke their own vows, private and unadorned, whispered only to each other in the vast, star-dusted wilderness. He promised her his protection, his loyalty, and his heart. For as long as he had breath, she promised him her mind, her strength, and her partnership. In all the days to come, he reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before gently cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. The touch was electric, a jolt of terrifying and wonderful intimacy. She leaned into his hand, her eyes fluttering closed. When he lowered his head to kiss her, it was nothing like the cold, perfunctory brush on the cheek in the church. This kiss was deep and searching, hesitant at first, then gaining a desperate, pent-up force. It was a kiss that spoke of shared loss and shared survival, of a loneliness so profound they had never thought to see the end of it. It was the kiss of two fractured souls finding their way home. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. He carried her across the threshold of the cabin, past the sleeping form of his daughter, and to the door of his own room. He paused, his eyes asking a final, silent question. She answered by reaching up and touching his face, her fingers tracing the weary lines around his eyes, with a quiet finality. He pushed the door open, and as it swung shut behind them, the darkness inside swallowed the lamplight from the main room, leaving only the promise of a new beginning. The next morning, the sunlight that streamed into the cabin felt different, brighter. The air itself seemed lighter. A quiet, domestic happiness settled over them, as comfortable and well-worn as an old pair of boots. Maggie found coal by the forge, a horseshoe glowing red-hot in the tongs. He was showing Nora, who watched from a safe distance, how the hammer could shape the unyielding metal. When he saw Maggie, he stopped his work and smiled that new, easy smile. "Mama Maggie," Nora cried out, running to her and hugging her legs, the new name tumbling out as if she'd been saying it her whole life. Maggie's heart clenched, and she knelt to hug the little girl tightly. They worked together that morning, a seamless team. While he shod the horse, she brought him tools, their hands brushing in the exchange. Later, she sat on the porch with Nora, guiding her small fingers as she traced the letters of the alphabet in a slate, while Cole, working nearby, would pause to listen, a look of profound contentment on his face. In the afternoon, they turned their attention to the abandoned well, the symbol of past failure that Maggie had declared would be their new source of hope. With two other ranchers who had come to offer their support after the hearing, they rigged up the old drilling equipment. It was back-breaking work, turning the heavy auger, clearing the rock and clay, but they worked with a shared, determined energy. It was more than a search for water. It was an act of defiance against the drought, against Crowell, against the despair that had held the valley in its grip for so long. For 2 days they drilled, their progress slow and arduous. Then, late on the second afternoon, as Cole was straining at the heavy wooden handle, he felt a change. The grinding resistance lessened. A wet, sucking sound came from the hole. "I think," he gasped, putting his whole weight into another turn, "I think we're through." He pulled the auger up, and the end came out coated not in dry clay, but in thick, dark mud. A moment later, a small trickle of water welled up from the bottom of the hole. A cheer went up from the men. They worked faster, widening the channel, and the trickle became a steady flow. Then a gush of clear, cold water, spilling out onto the thirsty ground. It was a miracle. Water, life. Cole let out a whoop of pure joy, grabbing Maggie and spinning her around, their laughter echoing across the prairie. Nora splashed her hands in the growing puddle, squealing with delight. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph, a promise that their future, which had once been as dry as the creek bed, would now be one of abundance. The celebration was cut short by the frantic pounding of hooves. One of the neighboring ranchers, a man named Henderson, came galloping toward them, his face pale with panic, his horse lathered in sweat. "Cole, it's the hay barn," he yelled, pointing back toward the main buildings. "It's on fire." Cole's blood ran cold. He turned and saw it, a thick plume of greasy black smoke billowing into the pristine blue sky. Their entire winter's supply of feed, their future going up in flames. There was no time for questions or accusations. He knew, with a sickening certainty, who was behind this. It was Jed Cutter's answer to their defiance. "Henderson, get the women and Nora up to your place. Keep them safe," Cole commanded, his voice sharp with authority. The other men were already running for buckets. "No," Maggie said, her voice firm, her face set in the same determined mask he had seen the night of the blizzard. "I'm not leaving. The horses are still in the corral, and the cattle are in the north pasture. Downwind. They'll panic. I'll get them out." Before he could argue, she was already moving, her skirts hitched up as she ran toward the corral, her voice calling out commands to the other rancher's wife. Once again, in the face of disaster, she was a beacon of calm, decisive action. Cole raced toward the inferno. The barn was already engulfed, the roar of the fire a living, hungry beast. The heat was a physical blow, driving him back. There was no saving the barn, only stopping the fire from spreading to the cabin and the other outbuildings. He and the two other men formed a desperate bucket brigade from the new well, the life-giving water now their only weapon against the destructive flames. The air was thick with smoke, stinging his eyes and choking his lungs. A sudden shift in the wind sent a wave of superheated air and embers directly at him. He threw an arm up to shield his face as a falling, burning timber crashed down nearby. A searing pain shot through his left forearm as a large, glowing ember landed on his sleeve, burning through the thick fabric to the skin beneath. He gritted his teeth, beat the ember out against his leg, and kept working, the pain a distant thing compared to the desperate urgency of the fight. For what felt like an eternity, they battled the blaze, their faces black with soot, their bodies screaming with exhaustion. Slowly, painfully, they began to gain ground, soaking the ground and the walls of the other buildings, creating a firebreak the flames could not cross. As the main structure of the barn finally collapsed in on itself with a deafening roar, they knew the worst was over. Cole leaned against the well, gasping for air, his body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. The hay was gone, a devastating loss, but the cabin was safe. The animals were safe. He could see them now, a dark, moving mass on a far hill. Maggie and the other woman on horseback, keeping them calm and together. They had survived. He looked down at his arm. A nasty burn, red and blistering, marked his skin. As Maggie rode up, her face smudged with soot but her eyes clear and sharp, she saw the injury immediately. She dismounted, her expression a mixture of fear and relief. Without a word, she took his arm gently, her touch cool and soothing on his heated skin, and began to lead him back toward the house. The new water had saved them, but the fire was a stark, brutal reminder their enemies were not beaten yet, and they would not hesitate to burn their entire world to the ground. Part 7. Night at the Dry Creek Bank. The fire at Bennett's Draw was not the end of the war, but the desperate last shot of a losing army. In the weeks that followed, a tense quiet settled over the valley. The ranchers, now bound by a shared enemy and a common purpose, pooled their resources to replace Cole's lost hay. The new well at the draw became a symbol of this fragile alliance, its steady supply of clear, cold water a promise of a shared future. But every man and woman in Dry Creek was holding their breath, waiting for the results of the county audit, the legal storm that would either vindicate them or destroy them completely. The news arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a dust-covered marshal from the county seat. He rode first to the ranch, a packet of official documents in his saddlebag. The audit was complete. The evidence was irrefutable. Judge Lawrence had found years of systemic embezzlement, fraud, and extortion. Warrants had been issued for the immediate arrest of Silas Crowell and Jedediah Cutter. A wave of grim satisfaction washed over Cole. Maggie, however, felt a prickle of unease. "They'll be expecting you in the morning," she said, looking not at the marshal, but at the horizon, as if reading a message in the clouds. "Crowell won't wait for the sun to rise. A man like that always has a second ledger, and an escape plan." That night, she couldn't rest, while Cole and the marshal planned the next day's arrests. Maggie lit a lamp and returned to the battlefield she knew best, the crate of ledgers and receipts. She wasn't looking for more proof of the crime. The judge had already found that. She was looking for its author, for the ghost of his habits, the shadow of his intentions. Her fingers traced the columns of figures, her mind sifting through the patterns of deception. It was nearly 3 a.m. when she found it. It wasn't a single entry, but a constellation of them, meaningless on their own, but a clear map when viewed together. Over the past 6 months, Crowell had made a series of small, irregular payments to a freight company she'd never heard of, the Midnight Star Line. A quick look at their sparse shipping schedules, which she had obtained while researching competitors to Cutter, revealed they ran a single, unscheduled cargo wagon south, a route that bypassed the main territorial checkpoints, its departure point, a discreet loading dock behind the mercantile, just 2 doors down from the bank. The payments were for wagon repairs and supply caches. He wasn't just planning to run. He had been building his escape route for months. "He's leaving tonight," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet of the cabin. Cole and the marshal looked up from their maps. "There's a powerful storm blowing in from the west, a dust storm. He'll use the chaos as cover." Just as she spoke, the wind began to rise, a low moan that rattled the window panes. Cole needed no more convincing. He, the marshal, and a grim-faced sheriff, Amos Lane, now fully and firmly on the side of the law, rode for town. They gathered a small, determined posse of the ranchers who had been most wronged. This was not a lynch mob. It was an instrument of justice, moving to prevent a final, unforgivable theft. They reached Dry Creek as the dust storm hit. The world dissolved into a swirling, choking chaos of red grit and howling wind. Visibility dropped to near zero. The town's familiar buildings were ghostly apparitions in the maelstrom. The wind tore at the signs. The sign for the Dry Creek Bank groaning on its hinges as decades of paint were scoured from its surface by the relentless, sand-blasting gale. They found them exactly where Maggie had predicted, in the narrow alley behind the bank, in the flickering, unstable light of a single lantern. Crowell and Cutter were frantically loading heavy satchels and a thick, leather-bound ledger into the back of a waiting cargo wagon. The secondary ledger, the ultimate proof. "It's over! Crowell!" Sheriff Lane's voice boomed, barely audible over the shriek of the wind. The 2 men froze, their faces illuminated in a tableau of greed and panic. Crowell, ever the politician, raised his hands in a gesture of placation. "Sheriff, gentlemen, a simple misunderstanding." But Cutter was not a man of words. With a snarl, he dropped the satchel he was holding and his hand went to his hip, drawing a Colt revolver with terrifying speed. The barrel glinted in the lantern light. "Get back," Cutter growled, grabbing Crowell and pulling the smaller man in front of him like a shield. "We're leaving." Sheriff Lane hesitated for a fraction of a second, the old fear of Crowell's power warring with his newfound duty. It was the moment the old Dry Creek might have won, but then he looked at the faces of Cole and the other ranchers, their expressions hard and unyielding in the swirling dust, and he made his choice. He drew his own pistol. "I am the law in this town. Cutter, put the gun down." Cutter laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You ain't the law. Money is—" He cocked the hammer, the click sharp and final. A shot exploded in the narrow alley, deafeningly loud. But it wasn't from Cutter's gun. Sheriff Lane, his face a mask of grim resolution, had fired a warning shot into the wooden wall just above Cutter's head. Splinters flew. The raw, undeniable authority of the act stunned Cutter into stillness before he could recover. Cole and Henderson surged forward, tackling him to the ground. The gun skittered across the muddy alley. Crowell, abandoned and defenseless, crumpled against the wagon wheel, his fine suit covered in dust, his face a mask of utter ruin. In the chaotic aftermath, as the ranchers held Cutter down and the marshal clapped irons on Crowell's wrists, Cole found himself standing over his nemesis. The banker looked up at him, his eyes filled not with defiance, but with a pathetic, sniveling fear. All the power was gone. He was just a small, weak man. And a wave of pure, hot rage washed over Cole. This man had tormented him, driven him to the brink of ruin, threatened his daughter, and ordered the burning of his livelihood. This man had caused the death of other, weaker ranchers who had given up in despair. The law would send him to prison, perhaps. But Cole's own code, the brutal, simple justice of the West, demanded a more permanent solution. His hand fell to the butt of his own holstered pistol. The rage was a fire in his veins. Screaming for vengeance, he could end it. Here, now. One clean shot, and the world would be a better place. His fingers curled around the grip. He saw Crowell's eyes widen in terror. Then a small, gentle pressure on his hand. He looked down. Maggie was beside him, having followed them into town, unable to stay behind. She had placed her hand over his, her slender fingers covering his knuckles. She didn't pull or tug. She simply rested her hand there, a point of calm in his internal storm. She leaned in close, her voice a whisper against the howling wind, meant only for him. "We've won. Cole, don't become him to prove it." She looked toward the street, toward the idea of their future, of their home. "We choose Nora's future with law, not with blood." Her words were like cool water on a burn. He looked from her earnest, soot-smudged face to the pathetic, cowering form of Silas Crowell. He saw the future Maggie was offering him, a future built on principle, on community, on being the kind of man his daughter could be proud of. And he saw the other path, a dark, empty future of revenge, a future where he was no better than the men he despised. Slowly, deliberately, he uncurled his fingers from the grip of his pistol. He let his hand drop to his side. The rage receded, leaving behind a clean, hard certainty. He had made his choice. The trial at the county seat was swift, with the second ledger, the testimony of the ranchers, the reverend, the doctor, and even a now cooperative Sheriff Lane. The verdict was never in doubt. Silas Crowell and Jed Cutter were found guilty on all counts and sentenced to long terms in the territorial prison. The judge's final rulings were a balm on the wounded valley. The assets of the Dry Creek Bank were seized by the territory. A portion was used to establish a new, community-owned bank. The rest was paid out in restitution to the ranchers who had been systematically cheated for years. All of Crowell's fraudulent fees were declared void, and the legitimate loans were restructured with fair, manageable terms. For the first time in a decade, the ranchers of Dry Creek could breathe. At the back of the courtroom, a quiet observer had watched the entire proceeding. Mrs. Eleanor Weatherly had seen the community stand together, had heard the testimony of Maggie's courage, and had witnessed Cole's ultimate choice of law over vengeance. When the trial was over, she did not return to her hotel. Instead, she approached Cole and Maggie as they stood on the courthouse steps. Her severe expression had softened, replaced by a look of weary regret. "Mr. Bennett, Cole," she began, her voice strained. "I was wrong. I let my grief and my prejudice blind me. I see now that Nora has a home, a good one, and she has 2 parents who would do anything to protect her." She looked at Maggie with a newfound respect. "You, madam, are a remarkable woman." From her satchel, she produced not a legal document, but a heavy, leather-bound book with a tarnished brass clasp. "I am withdrawing my petition," she said, handing the book to Cole. "This is for Nora. It's the Weatherly family history, going back 200 years. A child should know all the branches of her family tree, not just some of them." It was an offering of peace, an act of grafting her family's past onto Nora's future in the West. Later, Cole and Maggie stood before the old bank in Dry Creek. The dust storm had long since passed, leaving the air clean and the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The wind and sand had done their work. The sign that had once proudly read Dry Creek Bank's Crowell, proprietor, was scoured almost clean. The words faded to illegible ghosts. It was a blank slate, waiting for a new name. The season of Silas Crowell was over. The season of Bennett's Draw, and of the valley itself, was just beginning. Part 10. The season of full water at Bennett's Draw Spring came to the valley not as a gentle guest, but as a riotous, joyful conqueror. The snows of the high country melted, and for the first time in years, the creek at Bennett's Draw did not just trickle, but ran full and clear. It sung a constant, happy murmur. The water from the new community, well, combined with the heavens' renewed generosity, worked a profound magic on the land. The dormant grasses awoke, pushing up through the soil in a wave of vibrant green that washed over the beige and brown plains, chasing the memory of the drought into the far corners of the sky. The rebirth of the land was mirrored in the rebirth of the community. The alliance forged in the fire of the town hall hearing and tempered in the fight against Crowell's greed had solidified into something new and enduring. It was a cooperative in all but name, a simple agreement among neighbors to stand together. 1 week, the ranchers would gather at Bennett's Draw to help Cole with his branding. The air filled with the sizzle of hot iron, the bawling of calves, and the easy laughter of men who were no longer rivals, but partners. The next week, they would move to Henderson's place to mend his fences. They bought their supplies together, a wagon train of their own making that rode to Cheyenne and back, their combined orders giving them a power they had never possessed alone. The era of the isolated rancher, vulnerable and easily picked off, was over. The heart of this new community, in many ways, was Maggie. Her 1-room schoolhouse was thriving. The number of pupils nearly doubled as ranchers, now more secure, sent their older children back to their studies. But her influence had spread beyond the classroom. On Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, after the children were dismissed, a different kind of student gathered on the expanded porch of the Bennett's cabin, the women of the valley. At first, they came with shy, hesitant questions, their hands still rough from lye soap and garden work. They brought their husbands' confusing receipts, their own small egg and butter savings, and a deep-seated fear of the numbers that had ruled and ruined their lives for so long. With infinite patience, Maggie taught them. She started with the basics addition, subtraction, the simple art of balancing a household ledger. Then she moved on, explaining the meaning of interest, of assets, of profit and loss. She used her wooden ruler to draw neat, clean lines on their slates, bringing order to the financial chaos that had always been a man's world. It was a quiet revolution, conducted in the gentle afternoon sun, But it was as liberating as any legal verdict. She was not just teaching them arithmetic. She was giving them power, a voice in their own family's destiny. Nowhere was the transformation more profound than in Nora. The timid, thumb-sucking child who had once hidden behind her father's legs had blossomed, secure in the unwavering love of two parents. She was a confident, chattering 4-year-old, her laughter as constant as the gurgle of the nearby creek. She followed Cole on his chores, asking 1,000 questions, and sat at Maggie's feet during the women's lessons, practicing her letters with a fierce concentration. The name Mama Maggie was a permanent fixture of her vocabulary, spoken with a natural, easy affection that stitched the final, perfect seam in the fabric of their family. One evening in late spring, as the days grew long and soft, Cole came in from the last chores of the day. He was tired, the good kind of tired that comes from hard, productive work on your own land. The air in the cabin was warm, smelling of fresh-baked bread and the lavender Maggie kept in a small bowl on the mantel. He found her sitting in a rocking chair by the open window, not reading or sewing, but simply looking out at the twilight painting the prairie in soft shades of rose and gray. He came up behind her and placed his hands on her shoulders, kneading the tension from her muscles. He leaned down and kissed the top of her head, breathing in the clean scent of her hair. It had become their ritual, this quiet, end-of-day greeting. It was a reaffirmation, a silent thank you for the peace and contentment she had brought into his world. She reached up and covered his large, calloused hand with her own. For a long moment, she just held it there. Then, slowly, she guided his hand down from her shoulder, across her chest, until it came to rest gently on the soft curve of her abdomen. She said nothing. She didn't need to. He felt a faint, new roundness there, a subtle change in the familiar lines of her body. He went still. The sounds of the prairie, the crickets beginning their nightly chorus, the low nicker of a horse in the corral seemed to fade into a reverent hush. He looked down at their joined hands, resting on the place where a new life was quietly, miraculously beginning. It was a secret kept between the three of them, a perfect, unspoken joy. He knelt before her chair, his forehead resting against their hands, overwhelmed by a wave of gratitude so profound it left him breathless. After so much loss, so much dust and despair, his world was suddenly, impossibly, full of life. A few weeks later, they were sitting together on the porch swing he had built, watching the last sliver of a fiery sunset disappear below the horizon. The sky was awash in the colors of a cooling ember. Nora was fast asleep inside, worn out from a day of chasing butterflies and helping her father. A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that exists only between two people who know each other's hearts completely. Cole finally broke the quiet, his voice a low, gentle rumble. He was looking out at the land, at the green grass and the full creek and the sturdy cabin that was now, finally, a home. "I think about that day sometimes," he said softly, "in the town hall. The first one." Maggie leaned her head on his shoulder, her silver ring cool against his skin. "So do I." He smiled, a faint, sad smile of remembrance for the man he used to be. "I was so angry, so lost, so sure that my life was over. I thought they were punishing me, forcing me into a cage." He turned his head to look at her, his eyes full of a deep, abiding love that still, after all these months, made her heart ache with its intensity. He reached up and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his touch as gentle as a whisper. He repeated the words he had spoken in defiance and rage so long ago. But now, they were not a weapon or a shield. They were a prayer, a tribute. "That day, they forced the rancher to marry the old maid," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He paused, letting the memory of the cold, hard words hang in the warm twilight air for a beat. "Turns out, she owned my heart forever anyway." He leaned in and kissed her, a soft, lingering kiss that tasted of contentment and promises kept. The stars began to appear in the darkening sky, distant and bright, bearing silent witness. Here, on a small patch of Wyoming land, a family had been forged not by blood or law, but by choice. A choice made in the crucible of a blizzard, proven in the face of fire, and reaffirmed every single day in the quiet, simple acts of a life shared. They had learned that justice was not found in the barrel of a gun, but in the steadfast truth of a community, and that love was not a prize to be won, but a foundation to be built, one honest day at a time, in the season of full water. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed our time together in the Old West, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Night, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach even more listeners, please consider hitting the hype button to show your support.